the attendees in. Hello, everyone. I just started the webinar, so we're going to give it just a minute for all of our attendees to join, and then we'll get started. Camera, I went ahead and hit start, so it's recording. Okay, I see that a lot of our participants are here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar on engaging your community with participatory exhibits. I'm Jeanette Rooney. I'm the Assistant Director for Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society. I also am joined by this panel of museums who are going to share some of their experiences today. So I'd like you all to introduce yourselves. I'm going to start with Julie. I'll start sort of go by order on my screen. So Julie.
I'm Julie Park. I'm the director at the Elkhart County Historical Museum.
All right, Alex.
I'm Alex Craw. I'm the director of the Grover Museum in Shelby County, Indiana.
Thank you. And Michelle?
Hi there, I'm Michelle Nash. I'm the curator of collections at the Elkhart County Historical Museum.
And Patrick?
Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick McGuire, and I'm the curator of education at the Elkhart County Historical Museum.
And Danny?
Hi, I'm Danny Gonzalez. I'm Director of Exhibitions Research at the Indiana Historical Society.
Thank you, Danny. And Tamara.
Hi, I'm Tamara Hemmerlein. I'm the Director of Local History Services, and I will be monitoring the chat and Q&A boxes today. So welcome, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Once I find the option, and then we can start the presentation. Okay. So I have everyone's names and organizations up here. And then after the webinar, we'll be sending out an evaluation form and then also some resources. And so you'll have my contact information. And if you'd like to get in touch to ask anyone questions, I'm sure everyone would be happy to do that. So before we get started, I want to point out a couple things about the Zoom webinar platform we're using. Please note we're recording the webinar, so your microphones and videos will be muted. But if you're interested in submitting a question to the presenters, you can use the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And also through that function, you can submit a question anonymously if you'd like to. If you'd like to hear from your fellow participants, you can use the chat feature. That will allow everyone to see the question and then respond with personal experiences, resources, etc. And so we're so glad to have you join us today. If you'd like, you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box at this time. And again, like Tamara said, she'll be monitoring the chat box during the presentation. We will have a little time for Q&A at the end, but if something comes up that she feels needs clarified during our conversation and during our presentation, she'll pop in at that time. So, but be assured we'll be sure to get to all your questions by the end. Okay, so this is what we're going to be covering today. So first, what we're going to do is start with a brief overview of the exhibit development process, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some different ways your community can be involved throughout the exhibit, from planning to completion. We're going to talk about getting started with collaboration, some tips for planning and engaging audiences with interactive elements. And then after that, what we're going to do is have a group discussion with our panelists to hear some of the experiences for how this works at the Indiana Historical Society, the Elkhart County Historical Museum, and the Grover Museum. And then we'll talk about some tips and some lessons learned. Okay, so jumping right in, what does participatory mean? Nina Simon kind of did a lot of the foundational work on this. I have a quote here from her book, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But essentially, being participatory is a two-way street. It means we aren't just serving up content for our visitor to partake in, but instead we're serving to foster connections, to share and receive ideas, and allow our visitors and our community to sort of add and make meaning of our exhibit. And so what this means is that we can't really create our exhibits and our experiences in a vacuum. We really need that community participation. All right, so there are a couple of great resources that form the foundation for a lot of these ideas. Nina Simon's book, The Participatory Museum, I want to say that all three of these resources are actually available for free online. The full text of her book can be read on her website there. Another really good resource that Nina was also involved in is this community issue exhibition toolkit. It's got a lot of really good sort of methods and techniques, and it's a fairly quick read, but it's got a lot of good information and lays out the process. And then this education toolkit, it has a lot of good methods and techniques for museums and heritage education, which could be really well integrated into a participatory exhibit. So there's a lot of other great resources out there as well. And then when I do the follow-up email, I'll include some of those links for you. Okay, so I want to start with a quick overview of what the exhibit process looks like. I know most of you are probably already familiar with this, but I just want to do a quick overview because we're going to revisit it here in a couple minutes with a focus on how we can get our communities involved in this process. So to begin, obviously, we need to identify the need or the interest level for an exhibit and an exhibit topic. This really comes from getting to know our audience and our community, combined with determining where our mission and collections fit and what role we can fill. Then we have, once we've determined the need for an exhibit, we need to really identify the overarching theme or the big idea for the exhibit. Having that will help guide all of the content and scope and keep it on track. And then you also need to have a plan. Determine your goals, your audience, resources, space, timeline, budget, all of those aspects that go into creating the exhibit. Once you have all of that in place, then you can start with developing your content and writing the text for your exhibit, and then determining your layout, your design elements. And then while you're doing that, you can also prototype, sort of test out some of the things that you're doing, see what reactions you get from your intended audience. And then after that, your exhibit is open, but you're not finished there because you'll need to continue to make some adjustments as needed, hold any programs that you're doing, do evaluation, and then plan for the future for different exhibits that will be coming up down the pipeline. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the community can get involved in this process. There are several different things to consider. First, we have partnerships. So you can consider having 1 or 2 partnerships with organizations such as other nonprofits, groups, schools, even businesses. Now, I do want to note, this is not quite the same as sponsorships. It's not a financial or a transactional relationship. Instead, the relationship is built around common goals, shared goals, and it should be really democratic in nature, which means that you can guide the process, but you may need to give up a little control throughout the entire process. You can also bring in key community members or stakeholders from your organization at different stages in the exhibit process. They can provide content as the exhibit's being developed, give feedback and input, provide ideas. And then remember your audience, who the exhibit's for. they can be involved in the process as well. Are there ways that they can contribute to the exhibit through participatory elements once it's open? Are there ways they can share meaning and create meaning with interactive content? And then what will they take away from the experience? Okay, so let's look at this exhibit process again, this time through the lens of different ways you can engage your community. So one thing I do want to note, there's lots of different ways you can come at this. You can lead and produce an exhibit and invite community members and visitors to contribute specific images and content. You could collaborate with partners and community members to plan and come up with the ideas and the content. Or you could co-create with partners where your community is involved throughout the entire process from beginning to end. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So consider what's best based on the particular exhibit, scope, subject, your organization, and your community. And I think the main thing to keep in mind is just that you give your community and your audiences a sense of buy-in and connection with your organization, that their contributions and their input and experiences are valued and heard. And hopefully these ideas that we're going to talk about will give you some ideas to get started and some options to try. So going back to the beginning, looking at the need for the exhibit, we can have a careful consideration of past feedback from our audiences and visitors, and then also get some community input. Through your network of relationships in your community, you should be able to get a sense of what gaps you can help fill with an exhibit. If you're going to have partners, this can be done together with them. And then your big idea. So once you've identified that need or desire for an exhibit in your community, you can work together with your partners and key community members to determine the big idea and then work on creating a plan to develop the exhibit. Depending on the size and the scope, you can also consider at that point forming some committees with your key partners and community members. And that the committees then can handle different stages of the exhibit. So for your content and design, you can work together to determine what the exhibit will contain, what it will look like. You could invite audience members to submit content and get multiple perspectives on a topic. You could work with a committee to establish a design and know the overall direction. And then consider front-end evaluation with key community members and audience groups to see what resonates with visitors, what topics most interest them, what questions come up about the topics that you're thinking about, test out your ideas, etc. And then as you're further along, if you're planning interactives in your design layout, you can invite audience groups to prototype. One thing I want to say about prototyping is that it doesn't have to be entirely sort of a finished product. You know, you can kind of even, I've seen where organizations have just worked with the big sticky notes on walls and handwritten things. The main thing is to gauge reactions, see how well things are working, watch sort of body language, see what interests people, see if they can figure out what they're supposed to do in the interactive. But there's a lot of different ways you can come at that, but it's always a good idea to sort of get that feedback before it opens. And then finally, we have the exhibit open, but we're not done yet. So if you have interactives, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, maybe your audience and community can continue to add content and meaning to the exhibit through these activities. You might have programs planned with your community partners. And it's important, again, to observe closely, see how people are interacting with the exhibit, make any adjustments are needed, and then evaluate for your future exhibits. Okay, so how do you get started with this whole process? First, it's about building relationships. I know as museums, you're all already familiar with doing this sort of thing. It takes a lot of networking time. Same thing with when we're focusing in on our exhibits. So it takes time to network, to build those relationships and build trust. You might also not always know everyone who might have sort of expertise on certain subject matters. So using that network can help you figure out who to bring to the table. What people in your community might actually have some of those stories or background or information that you can add into your exhibit. And then it takes time to build trust. So you'll always need to be communicating fairly openly, taking time to listen and respond. And remember, it's a two-way street. So it's really important that your community members know that they're being heard. Meeting with the community should always be a safe, comfortable environment. And you'll have to remember to be flexible. And then above all, when you're working with your community on exhibit, you have to get comfortable with giving up some control. So the final exhibit might not look like you envisioned, and that can be a good thing, especially if it creates a better product that engages your audience down the line. And the whole point of including your community in the exhibit process is to make an exhibit that's meaningful for your community. And that means they have a stake in it as well. Things might not always go as planned. So, and that's okay. Just be kind of ready to adapt as needed throughout the process. You'll also need to identify your audience. So it's easy to say that an exhibit is for everyone, but it's important to kind of hone that. Think about who's most likely to engage with this particular content, who you want to reach, and that will help you with the exhibit writing and development. And then you'll need to establish, again, we mentioned earlier, a clear process. So set goals and milestones and a deadline. Be sure to communicate often. And it's a good idea to, especially if you're working with multiple committees or with community groups, to have a single point of contact. So consider appointing a project manager or that key person who can sort of bring all those multiple pieces together, coordinate logistics, all of those sorts of things. And then one other thing that's really important to remember is that when you're working with community groups, there might be a lot of different ideas and directions that an exhibit might go. And the process might end up being a little chaotic, and that's fine. But in the end, there needs to be a cohesive story. So when you first start out with your community meetings, be sure to clarify that big idea and the end user. And then while you want to be flexible and give up some control of the process and be open to ideas, remember that the exhibit can potentially have the possibility of getting carried away with too many voices. So remember to always keep the visitor and that big picture in that mind, and always come back to that main story. Okay, so real quick, I want to share this tool. If you've been in local history services workshops, I'm sure you've heard us talk about this before because we love logic models. But this is a really handy tool that can be used on the front end for planning. A logic model can be adapted for exhibits. It can be used for planning programs, all kinds of things, strategic planning even. It really actually works well as a group. So if you're working on a community exhibit, this can be a really good activity to do up front with your key community members and partners in the early stages of the process. So it starts by asking you to identify what need you're going to address. Consider whether an exhibit is the right fit to meet that need. So to fill out the logic model, it's going to sound a little counterintuitive, but you actually want to start at the far right and then work towards the left. So you're beginning with the impact section. Then when the logic model is completed, it will read from left to right. So basically, once you've determined the need based on your audience feedback, Then you begin with your impacts at the far right. It's the hard part. It's sort of where your audience research and input and evaluation and community networking comes into play. So what impacts can this exhibit have? These are sort of the really big picture changes that you want to make. It answers the question of what difference you can make in your community with your audience, etc. Then you move to the left and look at what are the more immediate outcomes. So this is the effect that you want to have in the shorter term. So how do you get there with an exhibit? This is where the outputs, which center, come in. These are the concrete, tangible results that will lead to the outcomes and impacts. So in the barest sense, you would say, well, the output is we created an exhibit. But for the logic model, you want to get a little bit more detailed. So maybe get into some of the stories that the exhibit will tell, some of the ways that you'll engage audiences in the exhibit that will get to those outcomes and impacts. Then you look at the activities. Those are the actual actions you're going to take to make all this happen. So consider, for example, community discussions, history research, collecting stories and images, designing and prototyping interactive, etc. And then finally, your inputs at the left. These are the resources that you need to make all of this happen. So we need these inputs or resources to carry out these activities, which will produce these direct outputs or results that will lead to these outcomes and long-term impacts. So this can be a really helpful tool to dig deeper, to really see what impact you can have and think through what you need to do to make it happen. Okay, before we switch to our discussions, I'm going to talk for just a minute about some different ways that your audience and visitors might engage with your exhibit and some tips for creating interactives and some participatory elements. Okay, so to start, it's important to remember that not everyone will engage in exhibits the same way. Some may not engage at all, and that's okay. People have different learning styles, different levels of comfort with interacting. Some people may want to use all of the interactive components in your exhibit. Some may want to contribute content. Others may just want to look. The key is to design your exhibit so that it can appeal to all of these different visitors. Okay, so one thing to note is that interactive is a little bit different than hands-on. While tactile experiences, hands-on experiences are very important, interactive implies something a little bit different. Interactive experiences by their nature are a little bit more of a two-way street. So interactives require more of a mental response and a reaction on the part of the visitor, and then in some way the exhibit reacts to the visitor input. So for example, the visitor is maybe given images to sort and then is able to find out if they're correct, or to see how their contribution sort of fits into the bigger picture. And then when you're considering interactives, always remember the intended outcomes and impacts that you determine for the exhibit, and determine how the interactive will help in achieving those goals. And then each interactive itself should have clear learning objectives. So think about what you want the visitor to think or feel or do, how they can get meaning from the activity or add to the experience of the exhibit in some way. So for example, creating art that becomes a part of the exhibit. All right, so there are lots of different ways that you can go with interactives. Again, I would recommend starting with your intended outcomes and impacts and then sort of brainstorming backwards based on those and how you can achieve those impacts. So first we have learning by doing or experiencing. This is where the visitor can try their hand at an activity to see how it works. This could incorporate role playing, sort of choose your own adventure, experiencing something of what it was like to live in a specific historical period. Some of the outcomes could include building empathy, gaining insight into a more in-depth experience. There's also a benefit to stimulating research skills and deeper insight through some analysis. So on the right, we have an example that kind of encompasses both of these. This is in our history lab at the Indiana Historical Society. And it's where, this station is where visitors can try out tools that conservators use in their work. So at this one, there are a variety of different documents in different types of materials, and visitors can use a digital microscope to look more closely and learn what materials they're made out of and see details of, say, how inks work on them. So visitors essentially get to see what a conservator sees and learn to look a little bit more closely and form some conclusions. Okay. That kind of leads us to our next example. Another way you can engage through interactives is by encouraging visitors to look more closely or examine something more closely and then process their impressions. So this is from an exhibit called When Home Won't Let You Stay that was on view last year at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And it was about the experiences of immigration. So on this wall, visitors are invited to share their impressions about what they see, feel, and think about the art on display. And the activity is structured to encourage visitors to also read the reflections of others. So you can also encourage deeper experience through creative activities, such as contributing to a larger art project or interacting in different ways with a display through their own interpretations. And then finally, it can be really important to make connections to personal experience. This wall was a display at the Minnesota History Center where they asked people to submit images that tell them why their history matters. And then the images of the responses were displayed. So there are lots of different ways you could go about this. But remember to try to make those personal connections. When someone can see the relevance to their own life, it can really deepen the experience to create more meaningful impact. Okay, so a couple tips real quick. First, always consider universal design and accessibility so that you make your interactives as accessible as possible to your entire audience. It's important to keep them fairly straightforward and intuitive. So set parameters and clear instructions. This is where the prototyping can be really helpful to see if visitors can figure out how to interact with the activity and benefit. Try to incorporate some different types of participatory elements. Some people, again, might want to do a creative activity, while others may want to do something that involves processing or sorting to get at those different learning styles. And then one other note, many times people come to museums as groups, as families and friends. So if this is the case, they may want to do an activity together. So consider how groups may be able to use the interactive together as a family, as friends. And remember that not everyone will want to do an interactive. So if you have an activity that involves adding content, such as an art project or responses to questions, remember to design it in such a way that people who just want to view the exhibit can still take meaning from seeing the contributions of those who use the interactives. And then people need a break between intensive interaction and intensive content. So make sure to balance your exhibit with some areas for contemplation, learning, and reflection with those places for action and interaction. And then obviously, you know, we're in the time of the pandemic, and who knows how far into the future this is going to go. So it's a good idea right now to explore some touch-free options if you can. This could mean anything from maybe if something does require touch, maybe you give visitors a stylus that's been sanitized and they keep it and use it throughout the entire exhibit. Maybe something interactive on their phones, or if it's requires writing. Maybe you give them sort of a clean, brand new pencil when they come in, that's theirs to keep. So there are lots of different ways that, museums were very sort of innovative by nature. So I know there's lots of different ways to go about this, but it's important for our visitors to know that we're working to keep them safe. Okay, so my last thoughts here before we start our discussion is to remember that our communities have stories and experiences to share. So invite those multiple perspectives that can help broaden our narrative. And then connect to current issues. One of the interactive outcomes that we talked about was making connections to personal experience. And this can be one of the most powerful ways to engage audiences. So people can often make deeper connections with subjects when they relate in some way to their own experiences in life today. And it's important to allow visitors ways to contemplate and process the consequences and influence of actions of the past. Consider larger implications. Essentially interactive and participatory elements really have the potential to convey the importance of history to our audiences. Okay, I'm gonna leave the screen up, but we're gonna move over to our museum discussion at this point. I'm going to start, Danny, if you'd like to unmute. So Daniel Gonzalez, again, is with our Indiana Historical Society. Danny, do you want to talk a little bit about some of our exhibits and how they're developed with community input? And
Sure.
I'll pull up.
For those of you who haven't been to the Indiana Historical Society, our exhibitions are a little bit different in that we have our sort of back in time experiences. We recreate historical environments and then people them with first person interpreters. So that plays a part in how we end up tapping into our community and using them for resources. But as we're doing exploratory research, we're looking for folks who can help us not only develop that research, but also help us in sort of a wide range of ways in terms of the development of the exhibit proper, but also in the development and the marketing of the exhibition and in supplementary programs and activities that will go along with the exhibition itself. So we end up forming an advisory committee that is made up of content experts, includes key community members, and also involves folks who can help us with these other aspects of development, marketing, and future educational programs. And that committee usually meets 6 to 8 months before the exhibition is set to open. And we'll meet when things work out the way that we intend them to 4 or 5 times throughout the development process. And at each meeting, we are trying to meet some very specific goals. Initially, we are introducing folks who haven't been a part of the process at IHS before to how we put together exhibitions. As I said early on, we are doing exhibitions a little bit differently with our back in time portion. And so it requires some explanation maybe. And I don't think that IHS is unique in that. I think every institution puts together exhibitions in a slightly different way, in a slightly unique way. Each institution has aspects to it that require some introduction. And so I think that is a really important part of this, is sort of acculturating your committee to how the institution does its work typically. Not as a way of saying this is the only way that we can work, but at least they understand how you have sort of developed and what your resources are. Later meetings are oriented toward having conversations about developing content, interactive proposals, and looking at how actors and the back in time space is going to be created and developed. And then finally, toward the end, you're having conversations about when it's going to open, about how those elements are going to be deployed, and about how your committee that you've created can help you as that exhibit opens and as it operates going forward. You start having conversations about the exhibit's launch itself, about ways to promote it in media or social media or through community organizations. And so those conversations sort of take you forward. And for us, that committee, those 5 meetings end up being a jumping off point. We have this development process, but those committee members are really key as we go into the training of our actors. So following the last committee meeting, or sometimes just before, we have a 4 or 5 week training for our first person interpreters. And the people who have been a part of our committee are really the core of who we tap to provide training to our actors and interpreters. And then finally, for educational programs and for marketing, those committee members continue to be involved as the exhibit goes along. So it becomes this really integral tool that we can keep going back to, this well of support, this well of insight for the exhibit's development and its run.
Excellent. And do you want to talk about a little bit about what we're looking at here?
Sure. Yeah, these are a couple of images. One is sort of a fun, interactive. We had a number of artifacts that we borrowed from Indiana University that were excavated from Angel Mounds in Evansville. And this is an exhibition where we're talking about the excavations, about the Mississippian culture. And we had, I think, maybe 15 or so artifacts on display, which was a tiny sampling of what was actually excavated, but sort of showed some different types of things that they were finding. And we put in these 2 magnifying glass that folks could take a look at. We put them at different heights for different accessibilities. The bottom one obviously targeting younger folks who were coming in, and they could slide that magnifying glass back and forth and look at these artifacts with closer views. And you can see toward the end, it's sort of hard to see, but there's a woman looking at one of our touch screens, and we had taken those artifacts and then provided some deeper context. So if you had looked up close and seen all those details, you could go learn where that artifact was excavated, what it was used for, and all those important things that will provide context for the artifact. On the other side is a good example of how our committee was able to develop our exhibit content and push it in a different direction. It was really important to make our story more inclusive and more complete. We had members of the Miami tribe. We worked with a few tribes, but this suggestion came from a member of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, who shared with us that we were talking about the Mississippian culture, which was not a culture that was still in existence, but that Native American communities were very much still a part of the community in Indiana and nationally. And so talking about Native communities today was a really important component of this overarching story. And so with their suggestions, we found ways of incorporating that story, including an oral history kiosk that you see here, where we heard stories from folks today about what the legacy of Angel Mounds, what the Mississippian culture means for their communities, and how Native American communities are viewed and seen in Indiana today.
Nice. Then
so this is a recreation of a Mississippian site. Again, we were relying heavily on the archaeologists and the historical staff at Angel Mounds Historic Site to figure out how this was going to look and how it was going to be put together. Just another view of the exhibit. This is inside of the You Are There. This is a broad view of our Madam Walker exhibition. And you can see a couple of like cutout figures that are freestanding. And this is a component that was brought about through feedback and conversation with our advisory committee. One thing that they let us know was that, you know, we were telling Madam Walker's story, but we were forgetting to provide the important context that race and racism played in her development and her story. That really needed to be drawn out as a major component and a major driver of how she did what she did and why she did what she did. And so these figures, 2 of them are Madam Walker at different points in her life, and the other 3 were folks who Madam Walker knew or worked with throughout her life. And they tell stories based on primary documentation about issues of race and racism that had impacts on Madam Walker, her development, on her company, on why she made the decisions that she made. And so we were able to access our collection. We were able to use that in a creative way to tell these important stories. And we wouldn't have necessarily done that without some of the feedback from our advisors. We also were able to find an artist through some of the folks who were advising us. Violet Reynolds was Madam Walker's secretary. We were able to connect with her granddaughter and grandson. And the granddaughter ended up coming and working with us as an actor-interpreter, playing her grandmother. And the artist who did this work was Violet Reynolds' grandson. He was an artist and did some incredible work for us. That's just
And there's a
view of
and then
and this is a view inside of the You Are There with Madam Walker. One other series that we do are our Be Heard exhibitions. We've got collecting initiatives. I think all of our institutions can recognize that there are areas of history. There are communities that have been underserved by museums, by historical institutions. And so the IHS has been active in trying to collect materials from the LGBTQ community, from the Latino community, from the Asian community. And this is an exhibition we did to highlight some of those materials that came into the collection related to our Latino community. And so again, this is a place where we were heavily dependent on community advisors. And this is a view of the Be Heard Asian exhibition, and the materials in the center and inside of the large oculi, the sort of kites that you see here, and in the background there's sort of a bunch of origami cranes that are hanging. Both of those were projects that were made possible through community partnerships and advisors who had been a part of the development of the exhibition.
excellent. Thank you, Nanny. Stay on there because we may circle back around and ask a few more questions. So thank you very much for that overview.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Julie and everyone at the Elkhart County Museum, Michelle and Patrick, to talk about your Crossroads of Elkhart County, Making a Place. So would you like to share sort of how this exhibit came about, how you involved the community, any lessons learned or thoughts, the additional tips that you might have from it?
Yeah, we're all here because we are the core team of this project, and I wanted everyone to be able to participate in sharing how we arrived at our plan. So let me just give a quick overview of how we got to Making a Place. The museum needed to rethink the introductory or the foundational exhibit that told the story of Elkhart County. We'd been in our building since 1968, and we had a lot of material on exhibit, but not a lot of information, not a lot of context. So the team started working on the Crossroads of Elkhart County project, which was instituted in 3 phases. And this one, Making a Place, is the conclusion, or the 3rd and final phase. And partnerships were critical to our process, but our focus on partnerships begins on the timeline or on the flow chart with content. And we began our work in our Native Gallery, our Native Cultures Gallery, with relationships that we were building with the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. And Diane Hunter has been a huge resource for us and a friend, and the start of a lifelong, I hope lifelong, long relationship for the museum. And we wanted these new relationships we were developing, not only with the Miami, but with the Potawatomi, to benefit the exhibit, but really more to create lasting benefit for the museum and the community. That instead of partnerships in order to get quotes or to get approval on the text, we wanted to build relationships that would inform how we approached our work in all areas of mission delivery. So partnership building was key, but it evolved over time how we use those partnerships in our 3 phases. So what I'd like to do is, in order to try to keep this brief, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and she's going to talk a little bit about community partnerships related to objects and material used in the exhibit. And then Patrick's going to talk about content.
Thanks, Julie. So when it came to collections specifically related to this piece of the Crossroads of Elkhart experience, we actually came into it thinking, well, you know, the bulk of our collection is 1850 to 1950, which is kind of the period of time that this gallery covers. In previous galleries, you know, finding objects had been trickier. We got tons here, but we kind of quickly realized, though, that they all kind of tell just one sort of specific, you know, white settler story. And we knew that we were not, we didn't have as many resources that told, you know, broader stories. And so that's been a challenge as far as telling stories of people of color, people who are just like the workaday people, not like the inventors and the civic leaders that you typically see. So we had to very carefully kind of pick through our collection, and we realized ultimately that we didn't have a lot of materials. So we focused a lot more on photographs, which we worked with different community partners to acquire. So a lot of a good handful of photographs in our collection in this particular exhibit are on loan, or, you know, were licensed to us. And we're actually kind of hoping that by telling this story, we also use a lot of oral histories and things like that, a lot more text and photos. And we're actually kind of hoping that this is going to be almost the launch point of inviting community members to help us build our collections to better tell their stories. And you know, realizing that we still kind of mostly passively collect. So along these lines, in 2021, we are looking at trying to do a major sort of active collecting initiative, reaching out to the community and saying, hey, these are where we have gaps. These are communities we haven't represented, and we would love to be able to tell your story, but you know, we know it's going to take time, and we're going to have to build trust. So yeah, so that's kind of more a major lesson that came out of this, and it's been interesting, you know, sort of building it. But that's kind of one, you know, major thing I want to talk about as far as the collection side.
Yeah, and from the education and interpretation standpoint, particularly with this phase, this third gallery, our community partnerships were extremely vital, because this particular exhibit, we interpret the history of 1851. We picked that year because that's when the railroad arrived in the county and really shifted the entire history, all the way up till today. And the important thing using our community partners was that probably the last 60 years or so of our county's history, we couldn't find in our traditional sources. So we had to rely on community members and community groups to help us tell that story and give us something to interpret instead of us trying to do that search. And then also from the content creation, we debated that idea of appropriateness. You know, do we have the ability to tell this story, or should we be telling the story with? And thankfully, our partners were able to help us. And even in some points where, due to the pandemic, we weren't able to build as strong of a relationship as we could, we were able to, thankfully, from the work of people before us, and one specific example, interpreting the history of our African American community, the museum has a really great oral history collection known as the Coming to Elkhart Project that was done in 2012. And that's where we were able to pull some of those really rich histories that the museum up until this point hadn't really told as well. So our partner, and the one thing, and we've been talking about Native things, we even we were continuing to work, and we continue to work with our Native partners. But the important thing for us in this exhibit is we wanted to make sure we included them. So they have a section of this exhibit as well, because working with our partners, they were very, and as Danny said, they were very, very important to them that we make sure that they are still represented in our history, that they are, once the removal happened, that, their story did not end in this location with them. So we want to make sure that we continue to bring that interpretation full circle and incorporate it through in our entire history, because we still have people of Native cultures that live in our community today. So our partnerships in this particular phase were extremely vital in just helping us interpret the history all the way up till today.
Excellent, thank you. And then we also have this, do you want to talk just for a minute about this interactive that you have as part of the exhibit?
Yes, so this is another way that, realizing that we didn't have the particular resources to interpret history up till today, we are leaning on our visitors and our community to tell us the story through, and you can see this is one of 3 what we call conversation stations in the exhibit. So the goal of our conversation station is kind of twofold. First, for the museum, it's to help capture the history of things or people's perspectives that are going on right now. And secondly, for the particular audience, it provides a space where they can potentially talk. If they're with if they're a family, they can have a safe space to maybe talk about these particular topics. And we envision these stations, there's 3 in the exhibit, to have rotating themes. So right now you're looking at one that has race and ethnicity. And what we've done, and you can see around there, is that we've taken 2 examples of topics where people have been marginalized or issues of racism. And in this particular section, you have one side dedicated to the African American community and issues of racism. And on the other side, stories about racism related to our Native cultures. And we particularly talked about the changing of a local high school's mascot, and you can see there. And you can see in the interpretation there, we have prompts that helpfully will allow people to start a conversation, whether and help to explain their own perspective. Now, for the solo visitor, currently we have an example, you can see the clipboard there, that allows people to record their histories and then leave them there, and the staff at the end of the day collects them, and that helps us inform our own interpretation going forward. So we have 3 topics right now: race and ethnicity. We have one about the urban-rural divide, because Elkhart County is kind of a perfect microcosm of that. We have, the city of Elkhart, which is an urban area, and then you go not even 5 minutes to the east and you're completely rural. And then our other section, which has gotten the most reaction thus far, has been about the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are able to collect people's history as it's happening, which is going to be very vital going forward as we're going to be telling these stories. And as things come up, we're going to be changing these topics. I'm thinking about, we need to adjust the context in the COVID-19 section right now, because from even 3 months ago when we first put them out, a whole lot has changed. So we can give new context as well. So it's been a really great way to help us bring our history to modern day by using our audience and our community to help us do that.
Excellent, thank you so much. All right, I am going to turn it over to Alex with the Grover Museum. Alex, I know you've been working sort of on an exhibit, Public Square, this year. Do you want to talk just for a minute about sort of your initial plans, and then maybe talk a little bit about what your plans are for the future with it? And I'm going to go ahead and exit the slideshow because we're done with the images there. So we'll just be there. So
Yeah,
Alex, I turn it over to you.
sure. So yeah, I guess from our end of thing, I can offer a little bit of feedback on what happens when participatory exhibit, when you're front loading all that participation, gets 0% participation. we had intended, a little background information, we had intended to launch a photography contest that emphasizes capturing Shelbyville's public square, a downtown historic district, as it currently was. And this was for 3 reasons. The city had announced that it was going to be going through an overhaul, changing the traffic configuration, replacing some of the parking that was central to the square, and making it more of a green space for people to engage in. The last time a shift like this had happened was in the 1940s, and there really wasn't any photography or images to capture what the public square looked like, save for maybe 1 or 2 pieces there. So we wanted to try to make sure that we were providing this for future use. It also had spurred a significant amount of, sorry, give me a second. It also spurred a significant amount of conversation around the public square's history and sort of the information behind all of that. And then the third part was that we had done this in the past. The Shelby County Historical Society had managed contests like this, and some of the historic landmarks that we had captured in the past were no longer standing. And so these images that we had done, that we had saved, were the only images of those given landmarks. So these were the 3 reasons going into it, that we sort of wanted to have this go on. And we wanted it through the eyes of our community as they saw the public square. So while we scrapped the majority of the exhibits that we had planned for 2020 due to the pandemic, this was a decision that we wanted to kind of follow through with. This began a 6-month kind of virtual push for submissions. We partnered with photographers. We partnered with some art dealers that are located in our county, and they helped sort of develop the guidelines and served as a panel of judges going forward. And then it was 6 months of information paired with the submission packet about the history of the public square, images from each decade, kind of highlighting why one might want to participate in something like this, saving something like this. And we had a lot of engagement. You know, I think we were averaging something like 400 like, shares, comments, questions, all that kind of stuff. And so many people said that they wanted to participate. And so when we launched it in September, when we started taking the submissions in to get it all ready, we were pretty surprised that we had nobody submit. And so this is like why it was so important for us initially to develop our A, B, and C plan. I always say that that's great, but we have the rest of the alphabet to worry about, and this was perfectly the case here. The A plan was 100% participation with some historical information and asking people sort of what values were being displayed here in this, you know, through these photographs. The B plan was to sprinkle in some of our own photography. And the C plan was sort of to reframe the whole thing. If we got 0% participation, and get the community thinking about how or what a public square is in the first place. It's the community's gathering place by definition. And so by examining all the photographs going forward, the ones that the plan that we currently have with information and biographies about people who have influenced the square, who've changed the square, and events that have happened there, what sort of values really are our community leaning on? Are they always good things that we value? And then on the participatory level, part of the questions that I've always wondered, the traffic pattern is a circle, and so people refer to it as a circle. It's clearly a square down there, and so I've always wondered where that etymological shift took place. And so we're going to be asking people to give their name, their age, and then a memory associated with that, and then voting boxes between whether they call it a square or a circle. And this will all be kind of compiled into a future traveling exhibit for educators to check out and use in their classroom with lesson plans configured with Indiana academic standards.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And so I know we're right at 3 o'clock, but if our panelists are okay with staying on for a couple of minutes, we may stay on for a few minutes, and we're recording. So if anyone has to head out, you'll be able to watch the recorded one afterwards. But We do have one question. I think this is, can you explain a little bit more about the history detective element as well? And I know, Michelle, you wrote some in there, but if you want to talk about it for just a minute as well.
Sure. So the history
Sorry.
detective element kind of weaves its way through all three of our galleries, because the Crossroads of Elkhart County Experience spans 3 galleries. And what Julia Michelle is a good explanation of what it is. But it was also, for an interpretive standpoint, it adds kind of more of a layering concept. And we work in different ways of interaction through all 3 phases. Like in the first phase, when we're talking about early native cultures, we have a history detective section where people examine stone lithic tools, but actually they're not all stone lithic tools because they're all formed by nature. So we're having people believe or guess to see if it was man-made or person-made. In the second gallery, we have one that's dedicated to kind of more critical thinking, where we're talking about the French as they entered this area and the native people encountered them. And that idea that especially the missionaries saw themselves as kind of protectors of the native cultures. And we're asking people for kind of a written response or critical thinking that, did these native people need to have a protector at all? And then in the third exhibit, like you saw in the picture, it's a little bit of a different concept where we found ways to incorporate things that might not necessarily make it in the main interpretation, but still were related to the content. So in that one image you saw, the main storyline is talking about railroad history. And our history detective section, and that highlights a person, because we wanted to make sure throughout our entire experience that we were bringing people's story to the forefront. So that history detective talks about a girl who became a celebrity, all because as the trains passed by her house, she would wave. And as trains would go by, she became a celebrity and people wrote letters to her. She was even got a free ride to Chicago and picked out a brand new wardrobe. So we have her story, which was kind of just showing the impact of the railroad on the community. And it's a really interesting story. There was a book written about her. So we have a copy of the book on display. So just kind of finding ways to add more interpretation and more kind of that interesting human element into our exhibit is what we envision with these history detectives.
Thank you.
One other thing I wanted to add, that Patrick and Michelle both very clearly explained the history detective, but this goes back more to relationship building and how we have found that this concept of relationship building for us and this trust building we're in it for the long game. So while we know that these partnerships help us get our text, we want our text to be signed off on. Are you okay with us using this picture? Things like that. But we had a really interesting thing happen with a woman that we were cultivating to help us to better understand the African-American experience. And it was Reverend Dr. Jean Mays, or Willie Mays. And she came to us to do some research, and we latched onto her like she was going to save us from ourselves, and continued to communicate with her and reach out to her. And nothing really came of that effort to cultivate that relationship until we were invited to participate in a new initiative to explore African-American history in our community, being led by the Anabaptist Mennonite Seminary. And we found out that they were turned on to us by Reverend Dr. Mays, who suggested that they call us. So finding a voice who speaks for some of these communities is very challenging. It's simple if there's a person like Diane Hunter, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. She has the authority to speak for the Miami, or the cultural leaders of the Potawatomi, in the Pokagon Potawatomi up in Dowagiac, or the head of the museum of the Citizen Potawatomi out in Shawnee. Finding that voice for the Latinx community in Elkhart County or the African American community in Elkhart County is more challenging, and it has been one of our areas where we really need to work harder to find inroads into some of these communities, community leaders. We've met with our new recently elected city councilman, Alberto Perez. He's on the Goshen Hispanic Advisory Committee for the city, but he doesn't really speak for all people of Latinx heritage, but he's a start. And those kinds of efforts are, we hope, going to pay off, but over a long time. We want to build trust that we are the appropriate stewards, not only for people's stories, but for their legacies. When they're cleaning out their grandmother's attics, they think maybe we could give this thing that's so important to us to the museum, and it would help them tell our story in a more rich way.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Those are all great points. And so to end us out here, I want to ask each of you real quick if you could share sort of any tips or a tip from your experience on working with communities or working with engaging visitors through exhibits. What tip would you share for other museums that maybe are just getting started with this? And Danny, if you don't mind me picking on you, can I start with you on that? If you would share any tips that you have from your experience on working with communities or engaging visitors.
Sure. I think, as a good sort of closing thought, there are a lot of recommendations and ideas, I think, that have been thrown around in this conversation. And maybe that's a little daunting because there's so many things that you need to do or should do. But it's okay to start in one place and build. And, I will say that no place that I've worked is doing community partnerships, is doing community engagement perfectly or all encompassing. There's no place that I've been or worked with that I see doing a perfect job or doing everything that even that institution wants to do. So, starting is the most important thing.
That's right. Yes. Just starting somewhere and knowing that, we don't have all the answers and we're not always going to get everything right. And that's okay. So yes, thank you. All right, Alex, can I throw it over to you if you have any thoughts or tips that you'd like to share from your experience?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess the general underpinning of our experience here was be willing to be flexible and have multiple plans ready to go just in case that first one doesn't go the way that you had hoped. I guess, and as you kind of laid out previously, Jeanette, anytime that you involve the community, there's a chance that it might not always look how you had originally intended. I think, given the experiences of 2020, fluidity is sort of the underlying current. So.
Yes, thank you. Okay, Elkhart County, Michelle, Patrick, and Julie, if you have any final sort of tips or thoughts that you'd like to share from your experience.
Well, just to repeat what I said about being in this for the long game, that relationship building should be for the long-term benefit of the institution and the community, and not to get a soundbite. That being said, you also have to be flexible. We had 2 great quotations from 2 of our community partners we were ready to use in our content that we really thought nailed this idea. And 2 different people pulled the quotes. They said, that's not, you can't say that. I didn't want to say that. So we had to go back and rethink how we were approaching that. But so flexibility, but also long-term advantage, not short-term checking a box.
Yeah, and to kind of build on what Julie said, probably one of the intended consequences, but we didn't know it at the time when we started building these relationships, of how far these relationships have trickled down, just not through our exhibits, but through our interpretation, through our public programming, all the way through, because our museum is part of a much bigger county park system. And just through the relationships we've built, we've been able to kind of transform across our interpretive services division, our interpretation of lots of different things, even to the point of things that are popular. We made the decision that we would no longer do them because they weren't appropriate to us. We didn't want to talk out of both sides of our mouth. So it's been a very rewarding and very enriching experience with all our partners. And like Julie said, it's something that we need to continue to foster.
And I guess I would just cap it by kind of harking back to what Danny said, just start. And I think if you just genuinely want to listen to your community, like, your heart's in the right place already. Like, and then you just got to start. But yeah, you just, it's going to take time, and things are going to turn out weirdly, differently potentially from what you're expecting. But if you come from a genuine place of wanting to listen and wanting to be inclusive, I think you're not going to step too far wrong. I hopefully.
All right. Well, thank you all. And Tamara left, put a note in the comments, which I think is a good way for us to end, which is think about your relationships as transformational, not transactional. And I think that's a good note for us to end on. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us in this webinar. Again, you'll be receiving an evaluation email from us tomorrow with a link to our evaluation form and some additional resources. Feel free to contact me if you have any additional questions or if you'd like to chat more about this. And I want to say thank you, all of you, for joining us today for this webinar.